Hello, welcome to this short lecture on business ethics and quantification. This lecture is based on a recent article that I've written in the Journal of Business Ethics called Business Ethics and Quantification Towards an Ethics of Numbers. So what I would like to do with this short lecture is to talk about what I mean by quantification, why I think it's important for understanding issues of ethics, and what are the different aspects of quantification that I think are important for you to understand and for us to discuss and to build deeper knowledge about in our attempts to understand ethics. First of all, what do I mean by quantification? What is quantification? I'm using the definition by Espeland and Stevens, where they discuss quantification very broadly as the production and communication of numbers. So numbers are ubiquitous throughout our society. They're becoming more and more important in what we call it age of datafication. But numbers can have many different uses. Sometimes they can be considered as measures for things. Sometimes they can be considered as ways of analyzing social phenomena. Sometimes they can be used in purely formal settings in which you might want to formally model something. So there are many different kinds of uses of numbers. Um, but the kind of quantification that I'm going to be talking about mostly involves what we are calling measures. That is taking experiences, personal experiences or social experiences, and rendering those in numerical form. So for example, you might take a personality test that would render your personal characteristics in a numerical form. You might take an aptitude or a scholarly test, which would render your capacities or competencies in an area in a numeric form. At the more macro level, organizations in their accounting practices try to render their everyday economic activities, their costs, and their receipts in numerical form. Countries, when we talk about their economic statistics, such as gross national product or inflation rate or other kind of economic statistics, what they're doing is trying to take their everyday social, economic, political activities and put those in the form of numbers. And the reason that they usually do that is to render those activities more legible, to be able to control and to track those activities. As we'll see, there are costs to rendering things as numbers. They often involve simplification, often a gross simplification of those phenomena. On the other hand, it does provide a technology by which those sort of phenomena can be administered more easily. So there are important questions that come up every time that an experience which is not originally in numerical form is to be rendered as a number. Okay, so some people have noted, particularly an anthropologist whose name is Marilyn Strathern, that we are currently living in what she calls an audit culture. That is a culture in which there is a strong norm in which more and more things should be rendered as numbers and should be reported as numbers if possible. So that many aspects of our life, which in other eras we might never have thought of putting in numerical form. For example, your level of friendship with somebody, the happiness of your relationship, maybe your performance as a teacher, or many other kinds of psychological or emotional aspects. For example, how happy or sad you are. In other areas, we might never have thought of putting numbers on those. Today, it becomes more and more important. People have more and more of a tendency to render those things as numbers, and subsequently to their quantification, to do things like build rankings as to, for example, who is the happiest or the saddest, who has the highest or lowest performance, who has the highest or lowest level of education or intelligence, for example, and to build evaluations on the basis of those numerical values. And in addition, once something is rendered as a number, it becomes amenable to mathematical analysis, statistical analysis, so that we can aggregate many people's scores in ways that we could come up with population values that never would have been conceivable before. So it becomes possible to ask questions such as, what is the happiest country, or what is the country with the happiest population? Those questions, whether we consider them valid questions or invalid, are the kind of questions which would have been very difficult to ask in the past. Okay, so finally, I want to distinguish quantification from something related, which is called datafication, for a couple of reasons. We often hear about datafication in a world which is now very strongly leaning toward digitalization, and we often hear about big data, for example. But I want to say that datafication and quantification are somewhat different. because for one, data can be rendered in words, it can be rendered in images, it can be rendered in things which are not numbers. So quantification is one form of datafication, but it's not the only form. Yes, and it's also possible to talk about numerical quantities without necessarily talking about data, but that's more of a special case, so I won't talk about that. So let me go into the question of why would we see datafication? Why is it quantification, excuse me, as important? Why would it be something that we would want to pay attention to? Well, as I mentioned before, there's an increasing importance of the use of numbers in higher education, as you have probably already noticed, in our descriptions of social and environmental activities, things like carbon markets, corporate social responsibility, sustainability are more and more rendered to demands for accounting and quantification and metrics. Professional activity, most jobs are now measured through some kind of evaluation schemes, and often those are quantitative. Psychosocial experience, your emotions, your thoughts, and even leisure activity. Think about apps which measure, for example, how many miles you've run and compare those to other people who are runners. Those can affect our behavior and shape the way we think about ourselves and others. Okay, so as these numbers get fed more and more through digital technologies in the form of algorithmic systems, big data, machine learning, they also are able to be monitored in ways that were never before possible, which has led people, for example, Shoshana Zuboff, to speak of an era of surveillance capitalism in which we're living. So understanding the forms of quantification is important also for understanding the nature of the governance mechanisms, for example, surveillance capitalism, to which we're submitted. As new forms of quantification emerge, we often begin to have new markets. Markets often depend on phenomena such as pricing, information, and those information become possible once new forms of quantification are made. So for instance, once something is quantified, it is much easier to put a price on it. Now, putting a price on something, commodifying it, is not the same as quantifying it. However, there is a very close relation between the two, because once something is quantified, then it's easy to compare with other things, and that makes it much easier to come up with a price for it. So for example, an apple and an orange famously cannot be compared, but once each one is given a numerical value, for example, how delicious it is, or how much somebody wants it, then it can be given, for example, a price, and it can be compared in terms of what is more expensive, an apple or an orange. So two things which were not comparable or commensurate are made to, in some ways, equivalent through their being put in terms of a number. So if you think about it a little bit, you see how powerful a tool that is to be able to take the many diverse, separate, singular things in the world and to somehow subordinate them to a system of equivalence that would allow us to compare things which were not otherwise comparable. That's an extremely powerful tool, and it can be used for good or bad. And so the idea of markets as a consequence of quantification is something that is of great importance. So more and more, we are not only thinking about numbers as a way of measuring things, but also as a way of governing, particularly when we're talking about things like sustainability. So when we have sustainable development goals, for instance, or environmental reporting goals or social reporting goals, we're often thinking about things we want to reach in terms of, for example, particles of carbon in the atmosphere or pollution. And when we do that, when we set those goals, we have to have a way of knowing that how we're going to reach those goals. And the tendency is to say, well, we want to reach a certain number, for example, a certain number of parts per million in the atmosphere. So there's a strong push to engage in forms of quantification once we have a social goal, a specific goal that we want to reach. Okay, whether that is the best way to go about reaching our social goals is another question, but there is an automatic tendency when we want to reach a goal to try to quantify it. Okay. And finally, in terms of understanding who we are ourselves, as I mentioned before, quantification has been something which has been applied to psychosocial, emotional, cognitive features of people. So often, even me, if I would like to know how I'm feeling, I might start, for example, a web app diary. I might log in my moods every day on my iPhone. And those kind of techniques of quantification give me understandings of myself. Those understandings, of course, are dependent on the nature of the measure and the nature of the scale, and often I don't think about that. But in the long term, that can change my sense of who I am and what traits of mine I think are important or not important. So those classification systems can change our ideas about who we are, our ideas about how our society is, and about how it should work. So all of those forms of quantification raise questions about the role of numbers in creating knowledge, in shaping behavior, and establishing new kinds of society. So they're very powerful tools that have a lot of responsibility with them. So let me talk about one dimension first of quantification that I want to call capture. So capture is something that I've alluded to a minute ago. It involves the point at which something that is in raw social experience, that is directly lived, that is not numerically rendered, is then transformed into a number. So for example, I might be having a conversation in a group, whereas at the same time that conversation, if it's being recorded, might be captured by a system in terms of an engagement score. I might simply be surfing the web, and at the same time an algorithm might be, or a computerized system might be looking at how long do I, in terms of seconds, how long am I looking at a web page. So my experience of viewing is then turned into a number by the system. So capture is when something that wasn't a number, that was just simply an experience, becomes a number. So some people have described quantification as a form of extraction, of somehow processing experience and turning it into something. Van Dyke refers to it as life mining, as it's a form that some kind of raw material is taken from our experience, is extracted from our experience through the form of quantification. And Jody Dean refers to this as communicative capitalism. And that's a process in which regular social interaction, once it's put on a digitalized platform, becomes turned into a kind of a metric of engagement that afterward can be marketized. So for example, my Zoom meeting with my friends can be turned into a data stream, and that can be marketized. So ethically, the issues of capture link to the idea that there is some kind of pre-existing experiential life world of experience, that we go about our day just kind of living from the inside out, interacting with people in relatively sort of naive kind of ways, not thinking of ourselves as engaging in quantification, but just simply living. But then later, that is somehow transformed into something which I guess is considered then artificial. And some people have called into question that idea of a pre-objectified, directly experienced sort of world. And there are some problems with that idea. So one of the things ethically that we would have to get our heads around is there such a thing as a sort of lived world before that kind of transformation? Or is quantification simply one kind of transformation of our experience? But our experience is always transformed somehow through our ideas, through our stereotypes, through our culture, etc. So what does quantification do differently than those other kinds of socialization and transformation? Okay, and then finally the question of if our experience is always captured somehow. For instance, right now, my experience is being captured through language. I'm communicating words to you. Language is also a form of capture, but it's not quantitative capture, it's qualitative capture. So for instance, what is the difference between somebody saying, I feel very happy, and describing their feeling, and somebody putting their feeling on a scale between 1 and 10? I'm a happiness level of 8, for instance. What would be the difference between those two different types of renderings? What would be possible with one and not the other? Okay, so after capture, I want to talk about another ethical issue of quantification, which I refer to as specification. So if quantification involves a question of do we or do we not transform experience into data, into quantitative data, the issue of specification is how exactly do we transform it? So for example, the same emotion might be rendered in different ways according to different kind of scales. One, for example, you might call unhappiness, the other might be called depression, the other might be called malaise, for instance. Right? So the way that a certain immediately experienced feeling is turned into a number could actually have quite different forms of different results depending on the way the scale was made. So the idea is, what should actually that number be? For instance, should we give a test to measure scholastic aptitude? Should we measure knowledge? Should we measure raw intelligence? Right. So the kind of measure is very important and has effects. To give an example that de Rosier gave in his book, the question of how do you measure whether states are providing good education to their citizens, right? And this was an important source of quantification. Traditionally, school and education was measured in terms of access. So, for example, what percentage of the population have access to fundamental education, to high school, to university, etc. And some bodies, for example, UNESCO, continue to measure access in terms of uh, uh, the educational metric. However, more and more, uh, education is being measured in terms of performance. So, for example, in the PISA scores, comparing different countries, they might ask who has the highest math scores, for instance. So you would compare school performance. Well, it does make an important difference whether you're measuring education in terms of how, inclusion into attainment and how much education is being allocated to the population versus what is the performance of the population, how good are their math scores. The first is really sort of a democratic principle of trying to include everyone into the system, whereas the second is essentially a kind of performance ranking principle. Who is doing the best, right? And so those are going to have very different kind of educational politics based on whether you choose to measure it as education attain as access versus performance. So that example kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of what are the stakes of quantification as specification. So once we've decided a number is needed, the hard question that takes a lot of debate is, well, what kind of number? What should be the metrics? And that's where the politics of quantification come in. And there are often debates as to why a certain metric would work better than another. And the third and final aspect of quantification that I want to discuss is what I call quantification as appropriation. This is perhaps the aspect that we hear most about in the news because it has to do with issues of intellectual property, with data protection. So once we've decided already that a number should be made to describe a social phenomena or experience, and then we've decided what should that number look like, what kind of scalar metric should be used to capture social phenomena, the question still remains, well, who controls that number? Who deploys the number? Who owns the number, right? When you produce data, for example, on your own surfing of the internet, to what extent should you be able to own your own data? When you write emails on something like an email platform and all your email is saved as data, to what extent should you be able to own, control, delete that data? Or can a large company simply appropriate that data and use it for their own services? And so a lot of the debates in digital these days have to do with the ownership and the control of that data and whether you're able to access or, for example, delete your data if you'd like. So that changes somewhat the ethical stakes of quantification from the question of understanding properties of something as numbers in that sort of philosophical sense of what are the properties of a person, what are the properties of a state, an economy. That's really a knowledge question. It changes that into property in an economic sense. Who owns? So in what sense do numbers involve a form of economic property that somebody can control, someone can exclude, someone can block or sell or give access to, etc. And who should do that? So the question of data production versus data ownership and control pose separate ethical issues, although those two might be related. So for instance, many companies will only collect data because they believe that they think that that data can later be owned and deployed by them. And they'll feel like an injustice has been done to them if they collect the data but then are not able to use it. On the other hand, if the decision to quantify something to render it as a number is determined by whether it can be marketized, well, that's fundamentally shaping our view of what the world looks like. Do we really want markets to decide what we see as objects, what we see as larger or smaller, greater or less? We want our fundamental categories of the world to be determined by what can be marketized and what can't be marketized. So numbers in that sense are a form of capital, and a strange form, and a form that we've only recently become to think of as capital, but something that has very deep ethical stakes. So I'd like to conclude by thinking of a few broader ideas about how we can do numbers, how we can do quantification in ways that are ethical. What do we have to think about when we're making decisions about numbers? So first, I would like to suggest we should reflect on what is the relation between metrics and our experience of life. How do our own opinions get formed by metrics, by percentages we read on the news, by ideas that something is getting bigger or smaller? For example, funding for research is getting better or smaller. Numbers, economic numbers are getting greater or smaller. How does that affect our experience and our sense of who we are and who others are and how our world is doing? So things as simple as looking at the weather and thinking about what temperature it is. How does that affect what you do and what you think and what you plan? So reflecting on the relationship between metrics and your lived experiences and your actions. Okay. Second, when metrics are created, anytime somebody wants to make a scale, the question of paying attention to who is included in that scale, who is able to input in that scale, and who is measured by it, and who is excluded when that metric is made, who is not taken into consideration when that metric is made. For instance, in an artificial intelligence system, when it is running data in order to learn some rules, whose data is being run on, whose data is not being run on. And that kind of question can lead to things like gender biases, racial biases that we've seen in artificial intelligence systems when they're trained on one form of data, but then have to act on a population that is not reflected by that data. Okay. Third, I'd like to say that paying attention to who designs data, who collects data, and who owns the data is something that's increasingly important and that we should think about in terms of ethics. And finally, I would like to close by saying thinking about numbers as a way of knowing, which is usually done, is important. We do know through numbers, and without numbers, it would be much more difficult for us to know the world. However, numbers are a limited way of knowing the world, and we can't reduce everything to a number. There must be other ways of knowing in order to have a richer worldview. Beyond that, however, thinking about what happens when a knowledge-based idea of the number, when numbers as a form of knowing become transformed into forms of governing, forms of doing, when something that was used to measure the world becomes, for example, a goal to attain. And I want to finish with this famous quote that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be useful as a measure. What that means, in my opinion, is essentially that once we stop using numbers to see what the world is, and think of it as something that the world should become, it fundamentally changes the nature of what a number is. So that's just the beginning of a very long discussion, which I was hoping to stimulate with this article. This is an emergent field of research and is something that we haven't seen a lot on yet, but I think in the coming years we'll see more and more discussion about numbers and their relevance. So I hope that this short discussion has opened up some of the main issues, and I hope it's been useful in your own thinking. Thank you.